Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. This is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian perspective on what's going on in the world. I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who's an economics professor at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
It's great to be back with you and having dodged the bullet of Hurricane Irma down here in South Carolina. I tragically feel bad for the people of Florida, but I'm glad it didn't come my way. Anyway, but it's good to be back with you and our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, I'm glad you survived it too. I guess you were probably among the price gouging crowd selling all your Mises books at exorbitant prices, huh?
Yes, you had to buy a Mises book for me at 7 times the normal price if you wanted to buy a gallon of water from me at 10 times the normal price.
Yeah, we're going to discuss Vietnam today, but there just is an interesting sidelight on the hurricane issue. It really did turn into an interesting debate over the price gouging issue. The New York Times carried an interesting article, which was fairly balanced on the libertarians that are leading the way in terms of rising prices and why rising prices are important in an emergency like that. And I think we have to go through this, unfortunately, with every hurricane and every emergency, but it does provide some educational opportunities as to the importance of the price system, the information that it conveys to people, and why government should not intervene, especially during emergencies, huh?
Absolutely. But it's a battle that we fight every time that there's a crisis. And there's another hurricane coming that's tragically going to hit those Leeward Islands and Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic, Maria, and it might come back to hit us on the East Coast. And if it tragically has that effect and communities are isolated and have difficulty getting back into order, the same battle politically and economically will be fought again. It's as if nothing is ever learned and nothing is ever practiced.
Well, hopefully it's not that bad. I mean, we do put these shows on to help some people get better insight into free market principles. For those of you that want to see the arguments on the virtues of the price system in an emergency, we've done a Libertarian Angle show on it. All the Libertarian Angle shows are posted at fff.org. I blogged on it a couple of times on that particular issue. I write a daily blog that's posted there, and we publish an article by Richard every Monday. If you'd like to subscribe to our email update, just send us an email or subscribe online at fff.org. It's free for the asking. Okay, Richard, Vietnam is now back in the news. You got this Ken Burns documentary that's coming out. Part 1 was on Sunday night of this week. And it takes me back all the way to, I think it was the May issue of Future of Freedom, our monthly publication here, back our very first year when you were Vice President of Academic Affairs at FFF. And we addressed the Vietnam War. I mean, we've been talking about foreign interventionism for the whole 29-year history of FFF. But I thought, well, let's discuss Vietnam, since it's obviously going to be back in the news with the Burns documentary. And let me start out with just a basic principle that I think everyone has to acknowledge, and that is that the war was illegal. It was illegal under our form of government. Our form of government is governed by the Constitution. That was the document that called the federal government into existence. And it sets forth the powers that the president has, that the Congress has, that the judiciary has. And among these powers is delegated to Congress the power to declare war. That the president is not permitted to declare war. He's not permitted to involve the United States into a war without that congressional declaration of war. That's the law. That's what the framers established when they called the federal government into existence with the Constitution. And there never was a congressional declaration of war. Sometimes people say, well, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was sort of like a declaration of war, but the Constitution doesn't provide for sort-ofs. It's very clear that before the president can initiate violence in the form of war, he has to secure a congressional declaration of war. And that's why Roosevelt, as much as Roosevelt wanted the U.S. involved in World War II, he knew the law prohibited him from doing so until he could secure a congressional declaration of war. Same with World War I. This is the law. And despite the fact that the law has been ignored since then, it doesn't make any difference. It doesn't affect the law itself. And so you've got this illegal intervention in which the U.S. intervenes in a country in really what was amounted to a civil war. That North Vietnam never initiated any violence against the United States. It was the U.S., by initiating this illegal intervention, that really was breaking the law. What do you think?
Well, I think that you're absolutely right in that America, since the Second World War, has followed a path of what is sometimes referred to as the imperial presidency that has many dimensions to it. But one has been the idea that the president has the wide discretion and authority to militarily intervene in other parts of the world, often with then followed legislation by the Congress somehow approving it or giving legitimized funding for it. Let's remember is that there was no declaration of war on North Korea or Communist China as part of America's leading role in the Korean War of the early 1950s. There was no American declaration of war, as you said, concerning the Vietnam War. The fact is that the Johnson administration, Lyndon Baines Johnson, did use this idea of, supposedly in the Gulf of Tonkin in 1964, a variety of pipsqueak little patrol boats of the North Vietnamese Navy had threatened U.S. military craft in the Gulf of Tonkin, that is off the North Vietnamese coast, particularly the USS Maddox. Now, most of the historical records show that it was a storm at sea, and what they were interpreting as patrol boats, Vietnamese patrol boats, were in fact wave caps that were picked up by the radar. But regardless of this ended up being used as an excuse for Lyndon Johnson to say that the United States, and implicitly its allies in that part of the world, such as the government of South Vietnam, were now threatened, and that it was necessary to have the authority to defend the United States and implicitly, therefore, defend our allies through an active and huge military intervention in that country. One that had taken us, beginning under Eisenhower, but especially under Kennedy, of advisors in South Vietnam, and our acquiescence in the assassination of a president of South Vietnam, Diem. And then Lyndon Johnson using all of that, plus the Tonkin fiasco and subterfuge, as the means to then begin an intervention, a military intervention, that eventually led to over 500,000 American soldiers being on the ground at one time in Vietnam, and through rotations, millions of American military personnel being involved in that war. There's also another element to this that I'd like to maybe extend this, and that is, what was the mindset of the people who were engineering and undertaking this foreign intervention in the Lyndon Johnson administration? The Robert McNamara's in the Department of Defense, the Dean Rusks in the State Department. Now, there appeared a book afterwards called The Best and the Brightest by Halberstam about these people. They were considered the whiz kids, the masterminds, the people who had the superior knowledge and insight to know how to micromanage government policy. And from one perspective, Jacob, we can understand the logic behind and what ended up being the disaster of the Vietnam War, the arrogance, the presumptuousness, and the pretense of knowledge of the social engineer. At home, Lyndon Johnson was instituting in 1964-65, the Great Society programs. We have the knowledge, wisdom, and ability to socially engineer and win a war against poverty, against illiteracy, against racism, all through the active micromanaging, intervention, regulation, control, and spending of the U.S. government. The same mindset, Jacob, is what guided these people in their initiation and the fighting of the Vietnam War. We know the degree of military force we need on the ground to just checkmate the Viet Cong. We then know the amount of aerial bombardment to initiate against the North Vietnamese. How much around Hanoi? How much around the port of Haiphong? Never enough to be threatening to hit Soviet ships in the port of Haiphong. Never threatening to hit the center of Hanoi and hitting diplomatic facilities that would reverberate around the country. The decision whether or not to bomb the dikes on the Red River, which would have flooded a good part of North Vietnam. But just this idea of controlled escalation, as they called it, to just know the amount of pressure, like a pincer, to make the North Vietnamese squeak and end the intervention. This idea that with arrogance, the social engineer can know enough to undertake a war and the pressure to be given and what type of forms of action need to be undertaken to bring another country to its knees. Now, what was downplayed in this is the fact that the social engineer cannot be a nation builder. He doesn't have the knowledge, wisdom, ability, or history to do so. This was the case in Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh was a communist. He imposed a totalitarian regime on the North. He did it with all the propagandistic and terrorist methods that are typical of the communist regimes of that time during the Cold War. But it is nonetheless that he was able to play a card that the United States did not have the ability to fully counteract, and that was Vietnamese nationalism. As much as many in the South did not want to be part of a communist Vietnam, they considered their own government in Saigon to be corrupt, oppressive, brutal, and a puppet of the United States. And then the Americans show up in these vast numbers. There's not one place in Vietnam where either Americans are not stationed or on active patrols a good part of the time. And with them comes arrogance, hubris, indiscriminate violence, bombing, and basically a contempt for the population. Now, My Lai, this massacre, became sort of a sort of a stereotype of that. And I'm not arguing that there were My Lais all over Vietnam. But the idea that in the heat of a war and the passion of a fearful moment, you become so angry or concerned for your own safety that you just start shooting indiscriminately because you don't know who's the good guy or who's the bad guy. That's one of the tragedies of war, and that was set loose, which the people in Washington, D.C. could neither control or restrict. And this all made the war impossible because of this arrogance and hubris that just as we can remake a new America through the Great Society, we can simultaneously fight a war 10,000 miles away and micromanage the escalation and the type of reforms and resettlements that can save Vietnam and make it a country that will be a bolster against communism and a model of democracy according to our vision. And these were all the disasters of the mindset of that era.
Yeah, let's go back even before U.S. interventionism, because I think it's important to understand the history as to how the U.S. ends up in this situation. I watched part one of the Burns's documentary, and he points out that after World War II, Ho Chi Minh, which as you point out was a self-avowed Marxist communist, approaches Roosevelt or Truman and says, look, all we want out of this is our independence. We've been suffering under French colonialism because we had the French Empire that was controlling Vietnam from what I can tell, the middle 1850s. And then later in World War II, Japan invades, and they're under the Vietnamese under a brutal Japanese occupation. And so Ho Chi Minh has this double sense. I mean, he's obviously a Marxist communist, but as you point out, he's also a nationalist. He says, look, this is our nation. It doesn't belong to France. It doesn't belong to Japan. It's our nation. We want independence. And the French say, no, you're just not going to get it. And the U.S. recognizes that Ho Chi Minh is a communist and says, well, no, we're going to support the French. So here you have the United States supporting this French colonial power. And so there's this brutal war between Ho Chi Minh's forces and the French that culminates in 1954 in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, where you had the hubris of the central planner from France thinking, oh, well, we're just so powerful, we're going to have this military outpost in the northern part of the country, and we're going to lure the Ho Chi Minh military personnel into a trap here. Well, it was they themselves that set their own trap, and Ho Chi Minh defeated them, and they surrendered. And as part of that surrender, you end up with a deal that the U.S. is involved in, and that deal is that while there's going to be two halves, the country's going to be, it's one country divided into two halves, there's going to be national elections. But the U.S. double crosses them. They double deal, as U.S. officials often do, because they recognize that Ho Chi Minh is a popular guy, maybe a socialist or a communist, and he's going to win the election. And the U.S. just says, absolutely not. We can't tolerate a communist winning an election. And of course, we saw that later on in Chile in 1973 when Allende wins an election. He's a self-avowed Marxist. Or in Guatemala in 54, Arbenz was a self-avowed Marxist, and the CIA goes and ousts him from power. So they double-cross them, and ultimately the U.S. gets further and further involved in this conflict with the notion that, oh, well, we can't let the communists take over the South because the dominoes will start falling, and ultimately the commies will come over and take over the United States. Well, all this was nonsense. It was just a straight civil war. And it takes us back to John Quincy Adams' famous speech in 1821, where he tells Congress, look, this is the foreign policy of the United States. There's a lot of monsters in the world, okay? A lot of bad things, despots, dictatorships, totalitarian regimes. But the U.S. government will not go abroad in search of those monsters. Well, the U.S. did go abroad in search of those monsters, and that's what gave us the Vietnam intervention. This was just clearly just a civil war, same as Korea was, but the U.S. initiates a violence with an invasion of the country, massive death and destruction, much wider than there would have been had the U.S. not intervened, and total disregard even for people in the South. You mentioned My Lai. There's a great book by Nick Turse that says My Lai was not an aberration. He discovered a lot of secret documents that established that there were My Lais going all across the country because everything mattered. All that mattered was the body bags, the body counts. That is, as long as the U.S. Military personnel would come in with large body counts, boy, that's all that mattered. And unfortunately, a lot of these bodies were South Vietnamese as well as North Vietnamese. So we end up with this massive intervention, and it turned out to be a big lie that the South Vietnamese ends up being absorbed by the North. The dominoes didn't start falling. The commies didn't come and get us. America didn't turn red. And here we are today, living with this legacy of foreign interventionism still.
I think that your point about all the counted was the body count. All that mattered was the body count. That itself is the mentality of the central planner. One of the things that stand out in all of the socialist planned economies of that Cold War era, beginning with the Soviet Union, is that how do you determine whether you're meeting the centrally planned goal? The quantity of stuff that you've met out of your factory, your enterprise, as defined by the central planner. So you'd have absurd things like in the Soviet Union, is that as long as the factory met its physical quantity quota, it had nothing to do with the quality of the goods being produced. One example was there was a bolt factory. And the bolt factory, the Soviet bolt factory, the government manager, decided that there was no way they were going to meet their target of bolts as in terms of tonnage. So what they did is they designed one of the machines to make just one giant, super massive bolt that when you weighed it met the target for the year. Well, that was one giant bolt. I mean, it didn't serve any purpose, but the count, right? The weight count was met. Now, this was the same thing. Here, they think that the number of people that you can confirm have been killed, is the indication of the success in which you're defeating the enemy. And these reports of the body counts would come out each week, and not just for how many Vietnamese, Viet Cong, and then actually the actual North Vietnamese army units, soldiers were counted in the body bags, but then there was the weekly count of how many Americans had died as well. All of this was a disaster. But if I can also just go back again for a minute or two to this French episode. The French had occupied Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia beginning in the 1880s, and they had made it one single colonial territory called French Indochina. They were unbelievably brutal and disregarding and contemptuous of the people there. When I was in high school, I had a part-time job after school working at the local public library. And one of the librarians there was a woman who had been a foreign correspondent in Southeast Asia in the 1930s. And she had spent a lot of time, doing the circuit. She was a reporter for the Christian Science Monitor. The Philippines, where the United States was the colonial master. Malaysia and Singapore, the British were the colonial master. Indonesia, which was then Dutch East Indies, the Dutch colonial master. And she was very regularly going to French Indochina, where the colonial masters of the Vietnamese, the Laotians, and the Cambodians. And she told me, I still remember it, she told me that of all the countries, the colonial countries that she visited over all the 1930s in Southeast Asia, the one in which the population hated the colonial ruler the most was in French Indochina, because of the contempt, disregard, abuse that the French imposed through their rule on the local people. So it is therefore not surprising that when the Japanese occupied French Indochina in 1940 and 41 and overthrow the French, there was no way that once a guerrilla movement began with Ho Chi Minh, and the United States was sending OSS agents to be advisors to Ho Chi Minh's forces, the OSS being the precursor of the CIA, because the U.S. was interested in supporting any anti-Japanese guerrilla resistance movements. That it was clear then that the Vietnamese were not going to accept the return of the French. But you see, at the end of the war, without giving meticulous historical detail, the northern part of French Indochina was occupied by the Chinese nationalist government and accepted the Japanese surrender. That is Chiang Kai-shek's government. The southern part of French Indochina, Cambodia and half of Vietnam, was, quote, liberated by the British, who had come from India, their bases in India. Now, the Chinese were not excited, even Chiang's government, in allowing the French back. But you see, the British government allowed the return of French forces through Saigon, the return of the colonial master that Ho Chi Minh and the other Vietnamese nationalists had made it very clear that they would oppose. And then they returned when the nationalist Chinese forces withdrew, they moved to Hanoi and Haiphong. And there were negotiations, but they broke down because the French were insistent upon returning as the colonial power, and the Vietnamese nationalists and especially Ho's communists were determined to resist this. And that became the basis of this new colonial war that went on from 1945, and as you were saying, the armistice and the temporary division of the country in 1954. And of course, once China fell to the communists in 1949, Mao's forces drove Chiang Kai-shek off the mainland of China to Taiwan. Now this was seen as the spread of the Red Menace. And so then the United States in particular, and especially once the Korean War started in 1950, felt that it was called upon as the arsenal of democracy, the bastion against global communism, to then support the French. And that's what began sucking us into this. Finally, as you mentioned with the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, the issue came up in the Eisenhower administration. How do we support the French from a serious and perhaps fatal defeat, which it ended up being eventually? And there was even proposals in the Eisenhower administration of using tactical nuclear weapons to try to undermine and destroy Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh forces, as they were called, that had that were in the surrounding hills over the valley of Dien Bien Phu in the extreme western area of northern Vietnam, and that who was one of the forces to persuade Eisenhower not even really to consider actually doing this? The head of the Senate in the U.S. Congress. And who was that? Lyndon Baines Johnson, which is the irony of history, that he persuades Eisenhower not to use nuclear weapons, yet a decade later he becomes the instigator of what was in the 20th century America's worst military defeat because of, as I said earlier, this hubris of the social engineer to micromanage a war and the defeat of communism.
Yeah, the series last night pointed out the point you're making of how much the people in Vietnam hated the French occupiers, mostly because of the arrogant way in which they treated people. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't point out the heavy role of the national security establishment, the CIA and the Pentagon in all this. As you know, America had been converted after World War II into a national security state, with the establishment of a permanent giant military establishment, what Eisenhower would later call the military-industrial complex, and then a CIA, a secretive police force with the power to assassinate, affect regime change operations, and the like. And we understate the power that this apparatus has. It's tempting to think, oh well, these presidents have led us into war. But really, the national security establishment has played a big role in pressuring presidents to move in the directions that sometimes the president doesn't want to go in. And the classic examples during the Kennedy administration in Vietnam, where the military and the CIA were pressuring him to send troops into Laos, send troops into Vietnam. And another fascinating aspect is that the CIA and the Pentagon could not distinguish between these nationalist movements and communist movements. In their eyes, any nationalist movement was communist and therefore had to be put down. And Kennedy saw through that. This is what distinguished Kennedy from your standard Cold Warrior. I mean, he comes into office as pretty much a Cold Warrior, except he understands the distinction that some of these countries want independence from these colonialist regimes. And one example was the CIA's orchestration of the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, which they made sure happened before Kennedy, a few days before Kennedy came into office, because they saw Lumumba, who was a nationalist, as therefore a communist, a distinction that Kennedy would clearly make. And then I think we also need to point out the conscription aspect of this. And conscription is always a part of these foreign wars, Richard, because they have to force Americans to do something that they would not ordinarily do. For example, if the U.S. government had not embroiled the country into the Vietnam conflict, how many Americans would have gone voluntarily and joined with the South Vietnamese army to fight the northern absorption of the South and the unification of the country? My bet is that no one, not even your most ardent general or colonel, would have resigned his commission with the U.S. military and traveled and joined the South Vietnamese army. I don't think any American citizen, they might have wished them well, they might have said this is terrible that the communists are winning, but they would not have given up their family life, their lives, their fortunes, or whatever to go over there and fight the communist regime. And so you need conscription. You need to force people to do these kind of things, which kind of gives you an idea of how worthy the cause is when you got to force people to go fight it.
Yes, the famous Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises, in a book that he wrote right after the First World War called Nation, State, and Economy, referred to conscription as the final tax that the government imposed, and he calls it the blood tax. They don't just take your financial wealth. They don't just regulate and control your enterprises, your businesses, the directions of production. They conscript you as a human being. They tax your person in the form of an in-kind service and send you off to war and bring about your death or your permanent injury, with all of the impact that has on those you leave behind. Indeed, I would argue that probably the worst mistake that the Johnson administration made retrospectively, from their own perspective, was to find a way to fight this war without conscription. Because once you had hundreds of thousands of Americans, young Americans, being absorbed by the military because of military conscription and the lottery system, where some could get a deferment. Oh, you're off in college, I don't have to go fight. So everyone else in society, those who aren't going to college because they don't want to, they couldn't stay into college because of bad grades and loss of their deferment because of the bad grades, they didn't maintain their academic standing. And then especially members of the minority community, and let's be frank, the African American community, who had a very low percentage at that time of young people who were entering colleges and being able to get a deferment. This was a seething effect on taking people who didn't want to fight, who didn't believe in the war, that aroused the anger and the animosity of families, though it divided families. You owe to serve your country. I fought in World War II. You should. It divided families, but it also meant that the other side of that divide were parents and family members who didn't want to see their young son go off to war when they saw that some others were privileged enough to be hiding on college campuses with the deferments. That was the worst mistake in terms of defeating their ability to gain support for the war, military conscription. I think you're right. They would not have been able to get the bodies to fight the war. And that was before drone technology, so you can't just bomb them without people. But the point is that that brought about the inescapable divisiveness that made this war unwinnable at home, the military draft. And if I can just add one other thing here, Jacob. There is available on Netflix a new movie that was just released called First They Shot My Father. Now, this is one of those stories about a survival from the communist terror of Cambodia. It's directed by, of all people, the actress Angelina Jolie, who tends to be a lefty, but whose father, John Voight, has very libertarian tendencies. But regardless of that, the movie runs for a little over 2 hours. I will be remiss if I don't say it's a bit slow going. It needed an editor to make it an hour and a half. But it is a horrific tale through the eyes of a young girl of what happens to their family under the terror of the Pol Pot Khmer Rouge regime in decimating them and many other people. And the living conditions that communist regime imposed upon them. But what is significant, and which the beginning of the movie points out, with documentary pictures of bombings and Richard Nixon on the screen doing one of his Oval Office addresses, is that the U.S. had decided that Cambodia was a sanctuary for the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese regulars, which it was, because of the acquiescence of the monarch of Cambodia, Prince Sihanouk. And the U.S. basically manipulated an overthrow of Sihanouk. He had to leave the country, and they put up this puppet guy, Lon Nol, in the capital of Phnom Penh. And against him, as a puppet of the Americans and the seething anger of the Cambodians, whose areas were being bombed in various parts of the country by the U.S. Air Force, this brought about the rise of an anti-American nationalist revolutionary movement, which tragically became led by Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge, the Red Cambodians, who were the most doctrinaire, most horrifically terroristic communists, even by communist standards. And this movie brings this out, just as the earlier movie, The Killings Fields, did a couple of decades ago about the Cambodian episode. Again, it's a little over 2 hours long. It does drag a little bit, but I believe that if you want to know the consequences for those people who were put under horrendous communist control, and by the way, I don't mean to go on by this, but I think it's important. In the little collective farm village where the family has been sent and suffer all these things, okay, they go through indoctrination sessions, and there's always the loudspeaker broadcasting, the party message. We are now one equal people. Individualism and private property are extinct. We must give up all Western values and bourgeois values of personality. The collective, the people as a whole take precedence. And over the loudspeaker comes a line that I've read was used. It is better to make the mistake of executing an innocent person than allowing the enemy of the state to get away. All of this is brought out in the film. And again, it's a bit long, but it's worth watching. First, they shot my father. But that war itself, that terror of the communists, was part of the spillover effect of American intervention in Vietnam.
Yeah, your point about people avoiding the draft that were rich and privileged was absolutely right. And we ought to point out there was also the way to do that legitimately was through joining the National Guard and the Army Reserves, because at that time it was clear that neither the reserves nor the Guard would be called up for duty in Vietnam. And this was how the rich kids got out of the draft. They would use political influence to join the Guard or the Army Reserve units. And, Richard, but where is the anti-war movement? I mean, the anti-war movement did a big service for America, because I think that we'd still be in Vietnam today if it had not been for the anti-war movement, assuming that the U.S. could fight the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong to a standstill if they were still there. I mean, that's when we see this forever war in Afghanistan and to a certain extent Iraq, 16 years now, and there's no end in sight. I mean, they're now upping the number of troops there. They're expanding the so-called green zone. And I just can't help but wonder, where are the anti-war people? The ones that oppose, that got us out of Vietnam, fortunately. And I think part of it is what you say, is that you don't have massive amount of troops that are conscripts that are being killed. The numbers are smaller than they are in Vietnam of U.S. troops being killed, and the perception is, well, they're volunteers, and so that's what their duty is. I think another one is that a lot of the anti-war people have become establishment. They've become absorbed into the national security state. They're big supporters of the Pentagon, the CIA. A lot of them are on Social Security now. They're scared to death that if they protest, the government might cancel their dole. And I think that's what we need, though. I think we need this revival of people that are willing to take a position against this foreign interventionism. And right now, it's the libertarians that are leading the way. But let's hope that other Americans start coming on board, because this thing is destroying America, not only with the out-of-control spending and debt, but just the corrosive aspect that it's having on the national soul, if not individual souls in this country.
Yeah, if I can just add to what you're saying before we finish, I know we're reaching the end of our time, is that for those who feel divided about these things, and what should my views be as a classical liberal or libertarian? Well, each one has to decide that at one level for themselves. But it's also important to realize that as part of the classical liberal intellectual tradition that went back to the early part of the 19th century, classical liberals always viewed that combined with individual liberty, respect for private property, rule of law, restrained monarchies or constitutional republican governments, and civil liberties, was the idea that governments should not undertake and have the authority to go out and fight wars. That war is the ultimate denial of a person's right to life, that war is the core cause of the destruction of both financial and material wealth, that it divides people rather than the market environment in which there is the potential for the harmonious integration and coordination of multitudes of people through the mutual benefits of market-based division of labor and peaceful trade. It's worth remembering that the free trade movement organized by Richard Cobden and John Bright that brought the end of protectionism and mercantilism in Great Britain by the middle of the 19th century were, among other things, free trade and peace. Free trade and peace. Limited government and free enterprise and a non-foreign policy activist government was the means of bringing about not just domestic prosperity, but the potential for international peace among nations. And that you had to begin practicing that at home before you could successfully preach it abroad. That is the tradition. It was the classical liberals who were very active in the late 19th and early 20th century during the Spanish-American War. William Graham Sumner's famous essay called The Conquest of the United States by Spain, saying we may have defeated the Spaniards on the ground in the Spanish-American War, but they have triumphed in changing the mindset of Americans to become aggressors and colonial powers, with all of the unintended consequences that flow from that. So, and there were many who were opponents of the First World War in the classical liberal tradition as well, including during the war. People like Albert J. Nock and H.L. Mencken. And that should be not long sort of. It is an illustrious tradition of classical liberals to believe in peace, prosperity, and freedom, and that is incompatible with aggressive governments and foreign wars.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, and it also is fortified by the idea that look, as libertarians, we're not like leftists. We don't support these communist or socialist regimes, which unfortunately leftists often do. You know, they think that the Vietnam Marxist regime was fantastic or Cuban socialism is awesome. Libertarians stay in a different position. We stand against socialism and all of the horrors that come with communism, but we have a principle of non-interventionism, that those are matters that need to be worked out by the respective nations without the, as you call it, the hubris of U.S. interventionism. So while we oppose socialism and communism, we also oppose the U.S. going abroad in search of those monsters or any other monsters to destroy. So on that note, Richard, we are out of time. Enjoyed the conversation with you, and I look forward to seeing you next week.
Until next time, and I want to just again, as always, thank the viewers and listeners for sharing part of their time with us.
Yeah, thanks for listening, and thanks for your comments on our YouTube channel. We appreciate them. We read them all. And if you want to know more about these positions, foreign interventionism, and also domestic free market philosophy, come to our website at fff.org, and we'll see you next week.
Jacob, wait. Let's give ourselves a plug. And for those viewers and listeners who are interested, we have a great book that we once published called The Failure of American Foreign Wars, which details the horrors and the real political and diplomatic history behind these American adventures from the 19th century through the Second World War to the Vietnam War.
Absolutely. And then we followed it up several years later, I think after 9/11, with Liberty, Security, and the War on Terrorism. So, yeah, those books give an excellent introduction into the philosophy of non-interventionism. So, on that note, Richard, see you next week.
Bye-bye.